Okay. All right. Hi, everyone who's watching. My name is Daniel. This is my co-host Todd here, and this doesn't have a name, nor probably will it, but this is just physical therapy when it comes to bodybuilding, all things rehab and injury prevention. So, Todd, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name's Todd Akers. I'm a physical therapist. I've been in practice now almost 8 years, pretty solely focused on outpatient orthopedic realm. That's definitely my passion. A lot of stuff involved in that. A lot of stuff that people don't even realize what goes into what types of things can be treated in that realm. But it's really fascinating, really interesting. Generally speaking, pretty strong sport background, but we'll leave that stuff to the side for later. Currently, I am a professional bodybuilder, and so working with strength athletes, physique athletes, that kind of stuff is just a massive passion because it's so ingrained in who I am and what I do, and the things I've seen through myself developing and growing is just stuff that is just so exciting to help push and share and just educate other people. My schooling background, I went to school at Texas Tech, so I graduated in 2015, so that puts me about 8 years of practice. But currently, I have started my own company, Apex Rehab. We can talk more about that later coming up if time allows. But I've started that essentially, just like I said, because of the passion I have for working with this community, working with individuals who are really seeking something at a higher level that sometimes, unfortunately, just can't be delivered in the best way in the traditional healthcare environment. But I'll stop rambling about me. That's a little bit of background. You can always ask questions. I'm happy to elaborate on any of it.
Yeah, two things actually. First, I should preface, I am not a physical therapist. I am a student physical therapist, which is
soon to be physical therapist. That's how you phrase it.
Assistant to the regional manager. But so I want to preface that, and then the second question was you said that like the traditional biomedical model isn't something that maybe is as helpful or applies as much to people in the strength sport, bodybuilding, powerlifting, CrossFit community. Why do you think that is?
So the difficult part, I want to make sure there's a place for these things, always. But the difficult part with how things are typically run in the biomedical model, and if you're not really familiar with what that means, there's just different thoughts of practice, essentially. But essentially, a biomedical model, if we talk about it in the orthopedic realm, it's you go get an X-ray, you go to get an MRI, we see something on it, we treat what we see. And that's essentially, in a nutshell, that's the biomedical model. The model that we really are pushing to follow in physical therapy is it's a biopsychosocial model. And while it's got this long fancy name, all it essentially means is when somebody comes in to see us, we look at what's actually going on. We look clinically, how do people move? How do they feel? Is there pain? Is there limitation? And we look to address those limitations, as opposed to something very specifically guided from some kind of testing, like an image, something like that. So the biomedical model, while there's a place, it oftentimes leaves out the individual. It doesn't take into account who this person is sitting in front of you. So I'd say that's the biggest limitation from that model.
Okay. So to transition and pivot a little bit, I'm interested in some like very bodybuilding specific, maybe like, I don't know if like concepts is the correct term, but just things that like bodybuilders do that most other people don't. So for example, let's just create a scenario here. You're 8 weeks out from a bodybuilding contest, and you have like a shoulder injury. Something happens in the gym, you feel a little twinge when you're overhead pressing, and now you can barely lift your arm over your head. You're not sure what to do. Like what is that person's like next step? Because in my history, as a very amateur and very subpar bodybuilder, it's been like, get as much ice on that thing as possible, take as much NSAIDs as possible, or ibuprofen or whatever, get the inflammation down, and then just try to find other exercises that don't hurt it as much. But then at the same point, in the same breath, I'm 8 weeks out, like I got to train through this pain. What's wrong with that, and what's right with that, and then what should my steps be? Like if you can kind of explain that.
Yeah, so actually you're pretty, most of that is in fact all of that is spot on. There's a degree, we'll elaborate a little bit. And there's actually one step that I encourage people to think of before when we're in this kind of environment. It applies to people not in this environment as well, but we'll just keep it in this realm. If something happens, the first thought you should think to yourself is, how much does this matter to me? Because you don't want to do something just because you think it's what you're supposed to do. You gotta, and there's varying degrees to this, of course. Like, I mean, you completely tear something, you rupture a tendon, that's going to be different, right? You're going to have a different thought. If you tweak something a little bit, your thought's going to be here. So you've got to think to yourself first, how much do I want this? How important is this? Because if it's only this important and you have a little injury, I'm going to tell you first, you're going to waste your time, because you're going to use that little injury as an excuse through all of it. And so you've really got to decide, how important is this to me? And if you say, I mean, I'm committed, I'm doing this. I mean, if you'd have talked to me last year, a couple years ago, the year I went pro, I'm like, no, I've been second place for far too many years. This is important to me now, and it's gonna happen, right? And so in that case, then now we go to the next step is, okay, I need to figure out what to do about this. So definitely in an acute situation, ice is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Typically, if there's like an active pain situation, ice is usually wrap it up, get a little bit of it. But to be honest with you, it's a very short-term symptom mitigator, because really we don't want to blunt our inflammatory response, which it's not. Ice, I mean, it penetrates barely into the skin, so it more just changes sensation. But that can be an important thing for us. Changing sensation may allow us to move better. So that might be a super, super important thing. So we've got to consider that piece of it. But if you're icing consistently through the entire 8 weeks, I'd probably tell you, hey man, we didn't approach this the correct way, right? If it gets inflamed every now and then and you're like, you got to hit it with something, great. That's perfectly fine. But it shouldn't be, I've got to stack this consistently, because that means that at a certain point, you've already exited the acute phase, even in that 8 week time frame. I mean, you're already now into starting to talk about, like, let's say it's a tendon issue. You're starting to talk, are we working into, a tendinopathy, a tendinosis phase outside of the acute inflammatory phase? So using those things in the short term is fantastic. But do consider, if you're having to always consistently do that, you've got to reset your mindset, figure out why. Figure out why, because it means you're pissing it off all the time. And if you're pissing it off all the time, you're going to get it into a chronically irritated state, and you're going to make your life way harder down the road, way harder down the road. There's research that suggests once you pass these phases outside of like the itis phase, the active inflammatory phase, into an osis phase, a chronic, disorganization of the tendon, we can be talking like a year to fully recover from this. Nobody wants to be there. But if we can properly manage in our acute phase, we're talking weeks, right? Weeks building into, and you're a prime example. You just said, hey, I've been working through this, and you're listing your time frame as weeks, which is exactly what you want to hear. You don't want to hear months time frame. It happens sometimes, but you'd like to not hear that. So to finish up on that with exactly what you said, modifying movements. Holy cow, you've got to modify your movements. You cannot be stuck in your head to say, hey, this movement pisses it off every time, I'm going to keep doing it constantly as much as I can load it. Not appropriate. It's going to stay pissed off. At the best case scenario, it's probably just going to stay pissed off. Worst case scenario, you're going to injure man more. If you have an acute, and we'll talk muscle tendon because that's the most common thing. I mean, and you continue to load it heavy and ignore it. I mean, anything can happen, but you don't want to push yourself further into an injury. On the same vein, you cannot be scared to load it. You have to load it. If we talk physiologically, and we start talking, we break it way down to extracellular matrix, all this kind of fancy stuff that actually happens in the tendon, around the tendon, muscle. You have to load tissue for it to heal. If you don't load it, it's not going to heal effectively. Now, how much you load it depends on how it feels. So the first thing is always like, I'm right there with you, Daniel. Like I've got a pec issue. It's actually on the opposite side where I usually have an issue. And it was all my incline movements. I could do anything. And I figured that out after a couple of weeks. It's only incline movements. So what did I do? I said, you know what? It's fine. People say you got to do your inclines to build your big chest, especially upper chest. And I'm like, okay, I don't disagree necessarily, but if I'm going to injure myself, I'm better off doing everything else. I got to grow the whole chest anyways. Yeah. And so I had to make sure I separated myself from these things that really aren't that important to make sure the health was in a good place so I can still push it. Because I can push all of these other movements excessively hard, almost to where, in fact, the feel afterwards is almost actually better now. And that may be because things changed up a little bit. You never know. But still loading it, avoiding the painful things. Now, the last piece of that, though, is I think it's really important to consider we don't always avoid the painful ranges. In fact, we have to train into painful ranges eventually. Usually, my rule of thumb, quote unquote here, not always, usually, is you can rest things for about a week. But if you're resting things for over a week, you're probably not on the right track. It's time to start getting into loading it. Now, how much do you load it, right? Well, it depends. Here, I'll give you my personal example. I started loading when I first had my tweak. I started loading with a chest fly on a machine because I knew I can take it through a good range. Weight is easily modifiable, and I can control everything I do. So I just gradually loaded it all the way up until like I've been starting with my chest flies where I usually end with them, but it's essentially just to load it first. And I'm chest flying more on this machine than I've ever done in my entire life. So I've worked through that, and now I've actually now shifted to, I'm doing an incline dumbbell press, but I keep my hands as neutral as I can. So I'm not out here necessarily. I'm keeping them in here. Oh, it's fantastic. No problem at all. Eventually though, I have to push back to the traditional pressing because that's what I want to do. But again, to kind of, without me stealing everything here, to take that all back, the idea is rest is not always the answer. You do have to modify your movements. You've got to decide what's important to you. So in the talk of prep, like, are you really in this, or is this going to be an excuse? If this is an excuse, I don't know if you've been there, Daniel, but I've been once in my life, and I promised myself I'd never do it again. I went through a prep into a show. I did really good in my first show I ever competed. I was like, holy cow, maybe I can do this, right? And then my second show, I wasn't in it. I was like, that's what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, I can do this. And I looked like crap. Diet didn't go well. Cardio didn't go well. Nothing went well. And I still got on stage, and I looked at myself and I said, holy shit, never again will I do this stuff if my head's not in it. And so in the case of an injury, decide what's important to you. If you're like, this just isn't the time, back it off, build back up. Your head will be in a better place next time if it's really right for you. If you know it's right for you, short rest, use ice if you need it, switch up movements to avoid painful. It may even be just shortening ranges. Holy cow. Like maybe you're doing the incline press and you just can't go all the way to the bottom, or maybe you just can't max squeeze at the top. Is it ideal? Well, no, but it's even worse not doing it because you're injured. So still getting some load through it's fantastic. And then the last thing is you do eventually have to start gradually, progressively loading the tissue to get it to really kind of strengthen and finish up that whole kind of rebuilding phase, if you will, of muscle, tendon, whatever it is. Of course, that's more specific to muscle and tendon, but really that rule kind of applies to all tissues across the body for the most part.
Yeah, you said a lot of really good things. I do have some follow-up questions, but I want to like recap them. So hopefully I get all the points right. So number one, what I heard you say was like headspace, like make sure that, this competition or whatever you have on your calendar is what you want to do, or else it's going to become an excuse. Now, my question about like pain and chronic pain, like moving into those like longer durations where you're experiencing pain is, I know just like from school, and I don't have any clinical experience with this, but just from the readings that I know that like if you experience pain, especially like with a specific movement or in a specific region for long enough, like there's some like neurological rewiring that can happen where that like you yeah, at some point this your body's really smart, right? Like it's going to heal itself, and whatever you did is probably healed after a year or so. But if you still have pain, it's probably, and this again, this is what I'm reading, it's probably less structural damage and more like of a neurological rewiring where now you're experiencing pain because you're expecting that pain. Can you speak on that at all?
Absolutely. So that's a huge thing to consider. People in our environment don't ever think about that, and it's insane to me because it's so important. It's interesting as physical therapists. There's been some studies, some surveys, if you will, done about like chronic pain, and physical therapists tend to be one of the jobs that has the least prevalence of chronic pain. And it's interesting. We think why, right? So going back to that, we think about like we don't in this realm, in this bodybuilding, the physique athlete, we don't think about those things. The biggest reason is because we don't know about those things. And so if we extrapolate that over to those studies that have been done, well, what do a lot of physical therapists know? Exactly what you just said. There's a neurologic component. And one of the best ways, if we kind of take this into some of the science behind chronic pain research, is one of the best things you can do to change those things is actually simply just education. Simply just education makes a huge difference. So if we tie that into what you're saying, there's kind of there's two things, two kind of topics that go into that for me. The one I think you're touching on specifically, generally we refer to it as kind of like a central sensitization type thing. And what that means then is if an area gets sensitized, like you said, our nervous system is going to learn. It's primed and so good at learning. And what's going to start to happen is while there may be no mechanical injury, anytime there's a sensation placed in this tissue, our brain is going to say, hold up, we've been here before. We've been here before. We know exactly what this is. This is pain because we've been there before. But in actuality, you may just be loading the tissue. But the brain the nervous system is picked up if it's been a process ongoing. Sometimes it can happen really quickly, but we'll talk about the longer thing. The brain is picked up on the fact that we've been here before. We were here before, and there was an injury before. And that injury was painful before. And so now every time we feel anything in that area, we're going to say it's pain. And that's not something that's under our conscious control necessarily, but the education on that these things can occur is what can help improve that, as well as, of course, loading the tissue and getting it to adapt to those sensations with the proper understanding. Now, one last thing I want to say about that. Please, anyone who sees this, do not take that as the reason to just ignore what you feel. Very different things. These are very different concepts we're talking about. You do not ignore what you feel. You've got to pay attention to it because it's going to help guide you on what we do. But just know potentially that is a process. And well, I'll just end it there. There's other stuff you can talk about as far as actual brain remapping, but that's probably not important for this topic.
It's just going to be like my mom and a bunch of meatheads that watch this.
Anyway. Oh, okay, just in case.
Okay, another thing that you talked about was not wanting to blunt the inflammation that happens like in an acute injury, like right after you experience something like that. Why is that? And just honestly, because like when I was a kid, like if you got injured, it was like put some ice on, right? Like that's what. And I know you said that's going to affect sensation, and it may affect how we move, but you don't have to go into like the cellular things going on here or the different metabolic cascades or anything like that. But why is blunting that inflammation process detrimental to the healing process?
So inflammation in the acute phase is required for healing. It's excessively necessary. Essentially, all inflammation are healing cells coming in to take care of the problem. And because they're coming in to take care of the problem, it produces swelling and heat. That's a very obviously kind of condensed thing about it, but you need that for the injured tissue to be broken down and then rebuilt. And that inflammatory process is actually a very positive process. It sucks because it means we're probably injured, but we have to go through the process. And actually, when we get into the chronic states, what happens is typically for whatever reason, our body didn't effectively, there's tons of things we can talk about that, but didn't effectively finish that whole inflammatory process. And so now we've kicked out and we're in this chronic phase where we're just stuck in this loop of re-aggravation over and over and over and over because it didn't effectively heal. So there's a lot of talk anymore, especially even bringing down the use of NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen, things like that, because they are literally designed to block the inflammatory cycle. While there can be positive effects from things, positive benefits, I should say, from things like that, there's a lot of talk that actually in the first few days of an injury, don't let it do its thing, let it heal. Now, obviously, there's varying degrees. If I sprain my ankle a little bit, I'm like, man, this kind of hurts. This is pretty sore when I walk on it, but I can walk on it okay. I'm probably going to say to myself, no medication for me. Let me keep mobile. Let it do its thing, and I'm better off. Now, if I sprain my ankle and nothing's broken, I'm like, I can't sleep. This pain is like a 9 out of 10. I can't walk on it, and we've confirmed that everything's okay. Maybe then I need to do something to make my life a little easier at that point. But we've got to consider that process is actually it is the healing process of an injured tissue. So ideally, we limit the amount of blocking of the inflammatory cycle as much as we can.
Okay. My next question, kind of switching gears just a little bit, was going to be about, like you said, like, don't be tied or married to specific exercises, especially when you are dealing with some aches and pains, and being dogmatic is just kind of silly. So in that instance, though, is there, I guess this is more of like a question like about rest, because like you did say, like, rest maybe the first week or so, like kind of lay off it. Do you find that bodybuilders or people in the strength sport, compared to like the lay person, do you feel that they're, I don't know how to phrase this question. I personally, when I injure something, right, like when I had my little pec tear, what I did was I almost rehabbed it too much. Does that make sense? Like I was like, okay, like I know I need to load this thing. I know I need to stretch it. And I almost felt like it was to a detriment. And then I almost like resting longer would have probably been the like the key to speed the recovery process. I don't know, but it just seemed like I was kind of regressing because I was too aggressive with the self therapy. I asked two questions there, and neither one of them were related to each other. So just go to the second.
So that's very possible. And so when we talk about loading, we talk about appropriate loading, right? You want to load appropriately. And what does that mean? And also, it's important to define what rest is. Rest to people can be very different. So you've really got to establish, what do people mean by rest? When I'm referring to rest, I'm referring to the far end of the doing nothing spectrum. If it's a pec, you can still train your legs, whatever, right? But you're doing nothing to put stress through the pec. When I'm referring to rest, I'm thinking of that,
Okay.
because that's the easiest way to absolutely define it, in my opinion. So not everybody calls that rest, though. Some people call a reduced load, not training to maximum capacity. Some people refer to that as rest, which I can understand where they're coming from. Technically, they're not stressing themselves the same amount, and so they're resting. Understandable. So really figuring out that definition is an important thing. So it sounds like in your case, you had the mindset of, hey, guess what? More is better. I'm gonna go because more is better. And what happens sometimes in that mindset is, we'll feel good here. Oh, I got this, man. I'm good. So what do I do next time? I'm going here. Oh, I'm good. What do I do the next time? I'm here. Okay. Okay. And then you go here. And you're like, oh, crap. Not where I wanted to be. When in actuality, this progressive loading should be slow, very slow and gradual. The idea when you load an acute injury is, I hesitate a little bit when I say this, because there is no rule in life that says we have to do things pain-free. That doesn't exist. That's not real. It doesn't exist. It's not useful for us. But oftentimes when you start an acute injury, this is the important part. You should try and find a movement you can load it pain-free. Start there, right? start in a way you can load it pain-free. I am a big fan of when I'm rehabbing a cute thing, I'm only going to pick a couple things to do. You know, I want to make sure that I can control what's happening. So the amount of variables are so small that I can try and track it. And I know you understand that when we talk about prep stuff, right? You know, it's the same concept. You change only exactly what you have to. So that way, when something happens, you know, okay, this is why we did this. You can map it out.
Scientific. Yeah.
Definitely. So in those instances, gentle mobility and gentle loading is where you start. And then you gradually progress up. You can't be in a hurry. You gradually progress up as you go. And you may start super low the first time. Perfect. You're still loading it. You're still stimulating the tissue in a way to cause it to help heal. And then what will happen is you'll start increasing a little bit and you'll start to, ooh, I feel that just a little bit there. Boom, that's where you stay. Don't progress past that until now you feel nothing there. Now we progress past it. And that can help keep people out of the realm that it sounds like you got into a little bit. You just, hey, I'm going good. Okay. It's not perfect, but I feel good enough. Yeah. Let's go a little more. Let's go a little bit more. And eventually you just hit the threshold. And hey, literally with mine, I did the same thing too. All right. So I could speak from personal experience as well. And so that's actually why I've changed all mine up. And I'm probably going to give it a whole nother month. I'm in no hurry. I'm in off season, right? And my chest is actually feeling better with the training I'm doing right now. So I'm going to give it a whole month probably before I go back to Smith incline and hammer incline, are the two where I tended to feel it the most. I got more time. I'm in no hurry.
Well, see, and I think that's a valuable skill set that you have there, because like for me, and I'm sure a lot of people too, is like, we feel like we're on the clock, and that every day that we're not coming in and beating the logbook, that we're behind, or that someone else is catching us, right? Even if it is at the detriment of not fully letting, or not letting tissues fully recover, and you know, loading up the bar before you're ready. So that's a really great thing that you have there. You kind of answered the next question, which was going to be like, is there an order of operations from point of injury to back to 100%? And it sounds like there is, right? It sounds like you said gentle mobility and gentle loading. Now, my question is there ever any place for, we can stay with the pec example, isometric movements? What about like loading concentrically and not eccentrically, or vice versa, eccentrically only, not concentrically? Is there so those are my questions. The next one was going to be like TENS and other modalities and stuff like that, but we can probably save that for another time. So let's just stick to just like the basic operations, order of operations, from point of injury to the time that you're ready to go full bore again.
There's definitely use for all the different types of, if we talk about the different ways to move. That's not the exact phrase I mean, but if we're talking about concentric, eccentric, isometric. To my knowledge here, now it's been a little while, the last bit of research that I'm familiar with as far as the isometric goes is that it can be very useful for decreasing pain. Now we got to keep in mind, loading isometric is going to load the tissue in that specific range and about plus or minus 10 degrees either way, right? So it's a very useful thing. Here's what I run into in clinical practice with isometrics. People don't know how to regulate them. It becomes incredibly hard to regulate how much pressure you're pushing because there's not really feedback to it. And that's what I run into clinically. I use them in practice. But if I cannot get somebody on the same page, then it's just not the right thing to do. Because typically if we're doing something and our body's not getting feedback, we think nothing's happening because we're not feeling anything, right? But the fact of the matter is, in acute injury, remember, when we first start loading it, we really don't want to feel anything at first. And so sometimes isometrics are a little tough there. But always those can be a very useful tool, because maybe you break those out in specific instances where we want this load right here, or we can't load this range, but we can load this range hard. because there's always going to be some crossover. But again, you got to remember it's about a 20-degree range of, if we talk about the stimulus to the muscle, plus or minus whatever joint system is moving. Now, talking about concentric and eccentric. So concentric is if we're doing a chest press, the way up, of course, you know that. Eccentric, the way down. Some of this, in my opinion, has to do with what part of the tissue is injured. When we talk about tendon, there's the gold standard for tendon rehab is to push the eccentric component of it. Essentially, the lengthening with the tension. What they've seen through research is that better helps kind of stimulate the tendon cells and help those fibers reorganize as they're going through that range. Now, that can be tricky for people. How in the hell do you do an eccentric chest press? Well, the fact of the matter is not very well. It's just not really a thing that can happen because you got to lift it somehow. Really the only way to effectively do it is you push with your other hand if we're on a machine, or somebody lifts it all the way up for you.
Yeah.
So there's some nuance to it, right? Because in an eccentric load, the idea is you actually load it heavier coming down through it. But if you try to move that same load concentrically, usually there's pain. Because that's the realm you're probably familiar with that we're trying to work in. Some stimulus, some irritation, a little bit of pain with the eccentric, but we're taking out the concentric so we don't have to force that press back up.
Okay.
So some of that I would say just depends on what's possible.
Okay.
You know, what is actually doable. And then if we go to the concentric side of it, I think the biggest thing I think about is just the ranges. You know, move things. Again, let's use a chest press for an example. If there's a all the way down, you're like, oh man, especially like on the rebound coming up. We always want to say we're perfect. We pause it and it's all chest coming up. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of stuff involved. And so if that's the range, stop working in that range for now. Yeah. Stop working in that range. You'll be okay, because if we equate that and we kind of extrapolate the isometric part of it, we can get some stimulus plus or minus 10 degrees studied in isometric. Well, if we're loading something, essentially there's a point where we apply pressure and nothing moves. That's a split second of an isometric. So we can still kind of extrapolate the idea that plus or minus 10 degrees. So if I'm stopping short of my pain range, I'm probably still stimulating tissue to some degree in the range I want. I'm just not having pain.
Yeah.
Jackpot. And so that's usually how I view the concentric piece of it, is where do we adjust the range to be able to get that load we want effectively.
So flirt with it, but don't get in bed with the pain.
That's right.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Running out of time here, but I want to do one thing.
Shoot already?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost been 30 minutes. We've been hammering.
I warned you, man. I could talk forever.
No, all this has been really valuable. But what I want to do now is I put up a Q&A on my story a couple days ago. I know I shared it with you, but what I think would be cool is to just pick one of these questions here, and just see if we can help someone here. Let's see. Okay, tell me if this is a dumb question or not. Possibly could be. So it says, I pulled my rectus femoris grade 2. So I'm thinking he means like a grade 2 strain. It's been more than 3 weeks and it still hurts a lot. How can I help heal this up faster? Now, I know you don't know this person. It's a very general statement. What are you thinking?
Okay, so anything that comes to people I'm not talking to in person, I'm going to load with one statement that everybody's going to hate, but it's so important to understand. Number one, it depends. Okay, I know you're used to hearing that, Daniel. So that's the only time I'm going to say it here. It depends on stuff. But if we talk about our foundational concept, we've kind of touched on a little bit. Number one, we got to figure out why it still hurts. Okay, there's the first thing. And so immediate thoughts that pop out to me and where it hurts, because obviously just because he strained something doesn't necessarily mean it hurts where we would think mid-substance muscle. It may not be there. So we got to figure it. So again, it depends. But gentle mobility, starting to load it, right? Got to do it. Got to do it, especially if it's 3 weeks. It's time. If this stuff hasn't been going on, it's time. And then figuring out that baseline of what's possible. and then starting to work into it. Now you touch for a second on, these are the techniques I use to modify people's symptoms very quickly to help them perform more effectively, essentially in the rehab realm. I mean, you touched on it for a second, so I don't want to like split this whole thing off, but other techniques, like if there's decreased mobility of tissue, so muscle, fascia, all of this stuff plays a role. We start thinking like, are there deficits from the injury going up into the hip because now you haven't been moving things effectively that are limiting the overall work that can be done, that are perpetuating this pain. But outside of gentle mobility and starting to load, different techniques like deep tissue, scraping techniques, dry needling techniques, E-stim can, but at this range, you know, it's one of those things where I think that's very much more a symptom modulator, which might be important, because if it sucks like heck to do some kind of, let's say, a single leg lunge movement to load it, and you strap some stim on it and it changes that sensation, and now we can do it, and we win. It's that easy sometimes. But all of those things are ways to modify essentially how the tissue moves, if you will, to decrease the pain while getting into the movements to load it. So big picture, mobility, load appropriately, and then sometimes some other backup techniques where you probably need somebody who's a little more specialized to help you with that to see. Yeah, that's probably where I start.
Okay, real quick, last question. What is your opinion on healing peptides? TB500, BPC 157.
Honestly, I don't know much. Straight up, I've heard of their thing. I haven't done a lot of research into them. I know there's strong research on the GH side for healing. So that one obviously is a thing. If you can get that and afford that, if you will. But as far as the peptides go, I'm going to be straight honest with you. Other than me, in fact, I was actually just asking somebody who'd been through it, like, give me some feedback. What'd you think? It's hard sometimes. Their feedback was essentially, I used it the whole time after I had surgery, but I don't know if it helped. I was like, oh, well, that doesn't really help my information, but that's okay. So short answer, sorry, I don't know. I don't know the research. I don't know. In fact, there might not be much, which is because it's a peptide, and well, we could get into the other pieces of why there's probably not much research. There could be not much research behind it, but I can't even quote that because I don't even know if that's true. But
yeah, there's probably some ethical dilemmas and stuff that no one wants to talk about anyway. Okay, well, yeah, thank you for coming on. I'm hoping this is going to be a weekly thing that we can do, and we'll see what feedback looks like. And then if you are watching and there's anything that you would recommend or suggest, please feel free to contact Dr. Akers or myself, and we'll certainly consider it. But until next time, I'm Daniel. That's Todd. Thank you very much. We'll see y'all later.
Appreciate it, guys.